this is, we're just going to turn this up a little bit. I'm just going to get myself organized here. I think we've got good volume. Let me know. Tell me what the volume's like in case I'm a little too low here. You just never know. Anyway, if the volume's too low, then I will turn it up. Got myself ensconced here with a heater, so it's kind of hard to move around, but I'll do my best to respond to everything, being my engineer self. And anyway, so what we see on the screen here, we're just going to carry on where we stopped yesterday, and I'm going to just elaborate on some of the ideas that we were talking about. I was able to find some of the video that I was referring to and a couple of the images that will help to illuminate the ideas that we were talking about yesterday. So again, we're referring a little bit back to Where Did the Towers Go? That is Dr. Judy Wood's work. Amazing work, and I'm referring back to a lot of the images that she used from 9/11, keeping in mind that these images were actually, most of them were created for the NIST report. That was the official government report. So none of these have been doctored or changed from their original state. They actually are the original ones that were used. And a lot of people don't realize that, they'll say, oh, we need an investigation. We need to have a trial. We need to look into 9/11. A lot of people don't realize that Dr. Judy Wood actually did take the government to court. You can't actually take the government to court. She took NIST to court because they did the report, and it was dismissed. But one of the things that the judge said that was kind of illuminating was, do you have a death wish? And I think sometimes we don't realize what we're embarking on when we get involved in these things, but she definitely did not have a death wish. All she did was notice that there were some anomalies, and sometimes noticing can be bad enough. And so anyway, she says the towers didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground. They turned mostly to dust in midair. And if you want to take a look at any of the videos that we've done together, Dr. Judy Wood and myself, just me facilitating her, really. But over the years, we've done quite a few different videos together, answering questions for people. But she's also done a lot of interviews and various videos where she explains the various aspects of her book, Where Did the Towers Go? And if you don't have a copy of that book, I highly recommend that you get that. It's an amazing book, but it's also a great value. I mean, there's hundreds of color photographs. It's like a textbook. And I think it's around $50, depending on where you buy it, but you can get it on Amazon. And it's well worth the money, honestly. But even if you can get it from your library or encourage your library to bring it in, that would be great. So we can all do something toward the effort. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is, again, we're picking up where we left off last night, talking about the fires, and just keep hearing on social media and, just in conversation about the idea that the fires are anomalous. Like, they actually have a lot of things that you typically don't see with a fire. And so on my radio show today, I was talking about this. I'm hoping that I can do justice because I feel like I was on a roll and it kind of came across a little bit more. So actually on my radio show, all I'm doing is focusing on talking. And so when I'm doing this particular programming, it's a little bit more complicated because I'm trying to keep up with some of the images as well and make it a little bit more interesting for people so that you can see what I'm actually talking about. But last night I was talking about this what was it? It was a weatherman who was talking about, as it turns out, it was chaff. I think I called it dross, but the weatherman he was ex-military, and it's almost like he accidentally mentions this idea of the stuff that's coming out of the sky. So again, we're talking about geoengineering too, and that kind of played into what we were discussing last night. So we can actually go back into that. But for any of you that were wondering about that particular video, I'm going to just play it for you so that you can actually see what I had in mind when I was talking about that.
Cloud cover in the morning hours, a couple of showers as well, but nothing like what they're getting in the eastern half of the U.S. As you can see, we've got rain and snow stretching from the Great Lakes all the way down to Florida.
Let me do that
at times
again.
Creating some major problems. This is the same line of action that blew trucks off the freeways yesterday in Iowa.
That's not very smart,
created
is it?
some downed trees. We had hail from pea to golf ball size throughout much of the upper Midwest Plains states, and of course it's still going on. Our fear is that rain in New England could create flooding issues yet again for folks in Maine, New Jersey, for example, perhaps all the way down to the Carolinas.
Okay, let me
Here in
try
the
that
West,
again.
we're
Here we
seeing
go.
a brief break, but there is a
Sorry
chance
about
of more
that.
showers coming our way by the weekend. Now, tomorrow it should be dry but cooler than normal, and tonight it's going to be cold enough that we might actually see some frost issues throughout the region. So folks in the orchard industry, even backyard gardeners, should take care of their plants. You can see scattered showers still showing up on the Pacific Northwest radar throughout the region. The heaviest, of course, well to our north. Here in southern Oregon and northern California, we've got a bit of an unusual situation. Now, this first portion of the radar cycle, fairly bland and typical, but then you see these bands of very distinct cloud cover moving into the region. That is not rain, that is not snow. Believe it or not, military aircraft flying through the region is dropping chaff. Small bits of aluminum, sometimes it's made of plastic, or even metallicized paper products, but it's used as an anti-radar issue, and obviously they're up there practicing. Now, they won't confirm that, but I was in the Marine Corps for many years, and I'll tell you right now, that's what it is. 50 in Medford right now, 48 in Wairika, 42 in Klamath Falls. Forecast for tonight, clear and cold, little patchy valley fog, and of course we've got frost and freeze warning up throughout the entire region, 25 to 30 tonight in southern Oregon's valleys. Coast tomorrow.
Okay, so I just wanted to get an image here for you so that we can just take a look at what a chemtrail is in case you don't know. Most people do know what a chemtrail is, but I'm going to be referring to that a little bit in the show, so I just wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page. In case you haven't seen such things, you know, this could be a very busy airport, could be people landing, I suppose, a lot of planes landing, and it could be a flight pattern. But the thing that you notice about this is that these trails remain in the sky. This is not something that I grew up with. I guess people are getting more used to it. They're actually putting some of the chemtrails into Disney movies so that we're getting acclimatized to them. But this is what the weatherman was referring to when he's looking at from above. Now, of course, the sky was probably not quite as filled with chemtrails as in these images, but these are actual images. I'm not going to go into too many more, but I just wanted to really clarify what I'm talking about when we're talking about geoengineering and chemtrails, because one of the technologies that we are talking about is electromagnetic frequencies. And if you take a look at the playlist, at some of the videos that I have on my list, you'll see an interview that I did with Dr. Ole Johansson. I also interviewed Jerry Flynn, who is in signals operations. He was looking into the whole smart meters situation because now very straight-laced. guy in the military, and just like this guy that we were just hearing. And they notice that there are some things happening that we might not even notice. And Jerry Flynn noticed with smart meters that they were giving off a signal that was very close to microwaves. And, we all know that microwaves are not actually very healthy for human beings. And so he started to get really concerned because he was doing it on behalf of his daughter, who was wanting him to take a look at some of the science behind that. And so he provided some really interesting information, just like Ole Johansson, who's had his studies suppressed. He's at the Karolinska Institute. He's had his studies suppressed since for 40 years. So should we say the 70s when he started, or maybe the 80s, early 80s, and the fire situation has a lot to do with the fact that these chemicals are being laid in a grid pattern above the sky. And then if you take a look at the smart meters, which we're going to do tomorrow night, I'm going to be showing some images of the fires that have taken place with smart meters. But I just want to lay the groundwork tonight so I'm trying to lay out all the different aspects, because I don't think it's just a simple answer. I don't think it's just, this is how the fires started and this is the technology used. I think that there literally has been a plan that's been laid out, and part of it is laying these chemtrails, part of it is putting the smart meters in. But if you take a look at some of these grid patterns, you can see definitely that there's a rhyme and reason to how they're being placed there. And it is a military operation. A lot of people may not realize that there is an actual government document that I think came out in the 90s, and it's called Owning the Weather by 2025. And we're coming darn close to that. So in case people are wondering, in case people are questioning, thanks. Sorry, I was just looking at the comments. Not all are do fires. Some are just Democrats with matches. Nice one. I like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, I'm sure. So we are going to take a look again at some of the images that just to compare what was happening on 9/11, because some people are really convinced that this is directed energy weapons. Now, of course, directed energy comes in all forms. Microwaves are directed energy. Anything that directs the energy at an object. In the case of a microwave, it's at the food, for instance, like an egg. It cooks from the inside out. And there's no question that the energy that was taking place on 9/11 had some of the same traits, attributes, but it's the delivery system and the way that the patterns of destruction that take place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you but again, I'm just trying to be my own engineer here, and I apologize if I'm not as quick as I need to be. But these are the California fires, looking at them from above. It's not, I would say this isn't necessarily, it's a satellite photo. So let's just say it's from space, just for sake of argument. It's a pretty good way of looking at them. You can actually see the fires. So they're not that high above the earth. I would say that it's taken from a plane as opposed to taken from a satellite. And I don't have the data on that, but really all I'm trying to do is to give you a comparison. You can see all the different attributes. You can see the smoke. You can see the smoke is white. Again, we're going over these images in the same way that Dr. Judy Wood goes over the images when she's doing her presentation. And again, I'm not speaking for her, but I've done enough shows with her that we have compared quite a bit of this, and we've done some things offline where we've taken a look at some images. And, I've had a really good, as I call it, an edumacation from Dr. Wood. And I've been able to really get a sense of how to look at an image, because that is her area of expertise. Not only is she an engineer, but she also has her master's degree in forensic imagery. Now, of course, that's probably not the technical term for it, but she looks at images forensically, just as people do when they're looking at a crime scene. There's things that people who are experts in that field can see that you don't necessarily look for if you're not experienced in that sort of thing. So what I'm trying to do with you guys is to help you to get up to speed so that when you see an image, whether it's on social media or somebody shares something, you might see something in it that other people can't see. Now, Dr. Wood has been roundly criticized because she won't weigh in on the California fires situation. She's gotten a lot of flack for that. And she did a show with Andrew Johnson, another friend who has been an advocate also for her. Now, she and I did a show last year, and it was after they had done their show. And subsequently, I took a look at some of the emails and some of the comments, and it was just unbelievable. I no longer follow you, or I no longer believe you because you won't weigh in, or because she didn't necessarily agree that the energy weapons had the same characteristics that you would see on 9/11. So, having taken a look at that, we're just going to have a look at this one. Now, this is actually a view from a satellite on 9/11, and what the Dr. Wood came across this when she was trying to. I think she was just trying to get an overview. I can't remember whether it was that she was looking for Hurricane Erin, which coincidentally was just offshore. But I think that was actually why she was looking at the satellite photos. It was either that or she was looking at this to look at the smoke patterns, and then she discovered Hurricane Erin. But in any case, she was looking at satellite photos. And that's a really interesting way to go about doing research when you're looking for evidence. They're readily available, and they're very objective because they're created by NASA. They're created by the Air Force. So there's no sense that they've been doctored or that there's been any finagling going on. But if you take a look at this, this is from a higher elevation. But to be fair, it's not that much higher than the one that we were just looking at with the fires. But you'll notice the color of the smoke, so-called smoke. It's not smoke. In fact, that is the building. Those are the buildings that are actually rising up into the atmosphere. Because one of the effects of DEW weapons is the fact that there's a helium reaction that takes place. And if you take a look at Fire from Ice, it's another video that I actually have on my playlist, but you can certainly find it in a playlist anywhere, Fire from Ice, and it's the story of cold fusion. And of course, the Department of Energy roundly debunked the Fire from Ice concept when Pons and Fleischmann decided that they were going to put forward their findings in I believe it's 1989. And interestingly enough, Stephen Jones was on that panel where they raised their hands, science by raising your hand to see who agrees, rather than doing experiments and allowing it to have an open-ended life of its own. Now we decide on science by raising our hands and saying, well, no, we don't agree with this. And so we have some bought-off scientists there and you can see all of this. It's online. Anyway, they totally discredited Pons and Fleischmann, but later on, there was a 60 Minutes interview with, I believe it was Pons, who was totally discredited. His life was ruined. And years later, some scientists said, hey, well, maybe there is something to this. So if you don't understand about cold fusion, either do I. But I have looked into it enough to understand that it's basically the idea that you can go, a million miles in your vehicle on a gallon of water. It creates energy. So it's something that is said to be impossible, and it's something that we're always looking for, a way to create more energy than is actually used to create that energy. So it gives off more energy than it takes to create it. So there's a surplus of energy, and that was the promising prospect of cold fusion. So a side effect of that is helium. And that has been proven in the experiments and in the science. So what this effect is here, if you take a look at it, this is actually particles of dust. So you saw how much dust was on the streets of New York on 9/11. And people said, hey, where did the towers go? This is where the towers went. This dust, although it's it's a fairly quiet day, not a lot of wind, and it's going straight up, but this dust was actually found along the Jersey Shore. It was found, miles and miles away. If this was a fire, then there's no reason why, for one thing, there would be dust rising, but there's also no reason why it would have been found miles and miles away. It had to have gone up into the atmosphere and then returned to Earth. So it was just climbing and climbing and climbing, which shows you that there is an anomalous effect here. So I just wanted to compare that again with the California fire. So let's take another look at that now that you've seen what it looks like when there's a reaction that takes place. This is a normal fire. This is what happens to smoke. And you can see where it kind of dissipates and it's kind of going off to the side there. And it goes up to a certain level and then it actually starts to go off to the side and dissipate. That's normal. That's what happens. And again, you can see the fires. So it's close enough to Earth that you can still see the sort of the rough edges of the fire in this image. And then I'm just going to go back and I'm going to show you this other one again, just for sake of comparison. And so you can see a different color. You can see the different characteristics, and you can also notice, like, this is not smoke. This is dust. So when people are talking about how do weapons work, directed energy weapons, this is, of course, you have to have a little bit of background in terms of having read and seen some of Dr. Judy Wood's work, Where Did the Towers Go? But we can all agree that there was, based on the fact that there should have been basically 12 million tons of debris that was left from those two towers. And in fact, it wasn't just two towers, it was all 7 of the towers disappeared. And that's a whole different presentation. And I invite you to take a look at some of those videos where we go over all of these things. But this is just really to explain the difference between the California fires, the weapons that were used on 9/11, and the possible weapons that were used and are still being used, presumably, in the California fires. And the reason is not to sensationalize this, but again, it's to bring it out into the open. Today, a friend of mine who lives at the equator, she has gone down and lives in South America, and we were doing some investigating earlier this year, and she sent me a note today. There was a story about the follow-up from the folks that were affected at the embassy in Cuba, the diplomats who had been attacked. There was basically what we consider to be an EMF attack, and finally, it's from the Canadian embassy, and finally, because there's been such visible brain damage to these people, and a lot of them, they can't ignore it. So what I'm trying to do here is to get people to the point where they can disseminate this information, come over to the channel, be able to use this as a resource. It's not the most sophisticated resource in the world, but it gives you the information that you need to be able to address some of these things so that you can easily go and compare these images, whether you want to take them from this video or whether you want to go online like I did and just be able to look at them, because it's so obvious when you look at them, that something else is going on here, that it's not your typical fire, but it's not the DEW weapons. Okay, so now here is what I wanted to show you. I was telling folks on my radio show today about the fact that I was making a rocket stove, because I think it has a lot of bearing on I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but just to show you what a rocket stove is. It's a very simple design, but it's basically taking, this specific design. You put the wood in through the side, and let me just see. I'm going to work that. Turn the volume down here. And so we'll just have this going so that you can take a look. Sort of interesting to watch. Very easy to make if you know how to weld and you know how to use a grinder. I have a grinder, but I don't know how to weld. So this is a guy. It's a speeded up version of making this rocket stove. And you say, what does this have to do with the California fires? Well, it has a lot to do with the California fires. Now, I'm considering making a rocket mass stove and putting it in, obviously not this design, but one that would actually go inside, because they're amazing in terms of how much heat they generate and also how just the technology that they use. And so I'm just, sort of letting this run in the background so that you can kind of get an idea of what the design looks like from scratch. And I may just, skip over it and go to the next video in a minute. But if you take a look at what he's doing here, he's actually putting together the stove in a way that it's at an angle here. And then what happens is that you put the wood in at horizontally, and it's slightly vertical. I think it's at a 45-degree angle. And the technology just sort of replicates nature, I guess, in a certain way. And it makes it so that the fire burns really, really hot, and it burns unattended so that you don't have to continually be stoking it. It actually, you can put the wood in and it sort of slides down toward the fire, and it combusts the wood in and just it actually burns it, and then it combusts it a second time, so that there's very, very little in the way of smoke, and there's very very intense heat. And so it's a really economical, ecological design. So there's lots and lots of different ways that you can do this. And this guy's obviously a really good welder, and he just sort of whips it together. Maybe it's just the way that he's edited the video, but I found it pretty impressive. If you want to take a look for a video on making a rocket stove, then I will leave. I'll try and get this one, and I'll leave it on redpillsquare.com so that you can go over there and take a look. I've also got a couple of other articles on some of the topics that I'm talking about today, including the article that came out today about the diplomats that are finally being believed by the government. They're looking into the EMFs, and they're calling it weapons. They're calling it EMF weapons, and I find that really interesting. So edumacation, yeah, thanks, Tom. That's exactly what it is, an edumacation. So I'm edumacating everyone right now, including myself, and I'm just sharing the education that I've gotten about rocket stoves because I think it's really important. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this whole thing. What I am going to do, however, is I'm going to play a video of the actual rocket stove. This is quite a quick video, and I want you to listen to the rocket stove itself and hear why it's called a rocket stove. And the reason is because it sounds like a rocket when it is burning. It gets so hot and so intense. And so let's see if we can actually hear it. Okay, so I'm not going to translate, but I just thought this was a really great one. Okay, so hopefully you could hear the roar that went on there, because I think it's really, really important to be able to get a sense of what it sounds like, what a rocket stove sounds like, because that's it just kind of gives you a microcosm of what's actually happening. Let me just take a look here. I'm just going to show you this is what I'm looking at on my screen, and I just wanted to check out for you some of the other images here that I'm looking at. And so these are all just images of that I've seen randomly when I did a search for chemtrails, just so that we can see that. Now, you say, what do chemtrails and rocket stoves have to do with each other? And well, you might ask that question. I think it's a great question. What they have to do with each other is the fact that there's a way in which a fire, of course, needs to be started, and there's a way in which it needs to be accelerated. And I think a lot of people have a difficult time with the fact that these fires that we've been seeing in California just seem to be so incredibly intense, and they just don't understand. Basically they're saying there's no way that this can be a normal fire, so quote unquote normal fire. And so those of you that haven't seen the video about the Australian fires may not recognize the fact that fires burn very, very hot given certain conditions. And in Australia, I guess the conditions are quite similar to what they are in California right now. There's drought conditions. And, in 2009, they had a fire that was very deadly. And there's some interviews with people who basically say, there was no way out. One woman was just leaving, and her husband was just behind, and yet he was lost in the fire. And so if we combine some of this technology, because that's what it is, when we look at these images, these are not normal images of the sky. This is not what the sky used to look like. When we see a contrail is actually ice crystals that form at 30,000 feet or so on a plane. And generally speaking, they dissipate after a couple of plane lengths. But a chemtrail contains aluminum, strontium, barium, who knows what else. But when we saw the weatherman at the beginning of this broadcast, you could actually hear him. He was quite surprised, and he was talking about how the chemtrails, well, he didn't call them chemtrails, but he was saying that there was chaff that was being delivered to the ground. And so my sense is that the aluminum is interacting with the smart meters. And so my brother posted something on his social media site, and of course it was about the trees. The trees were not burning, and yet sorry, I'm just trying to find an image for you, so I'm just going to take a look. I've got some images here to go along with this. And okay, so let me just open up this image here for you, and we'll take a look at it. This is from California, and so you can see what I'm talking about. There's some trees standing, and yet these houses are completely leveled. And so some people take a look at this, and they see it as being
nothing like what they're getting in the eastern half of the U.S. As you can see, we've got rain and snow stretching from the Great Lakes all the way down.
Mr. Chaffman. Okay, sorry about that. He really wanted to talk again. That weatherman, he's like Jim Acosta. Just wants to, let's turn that down to rocket stove sound. We've got everything going. It's crazy. So right now we've just got a picture and the sound of me droning on. But I think it's important, again, to take a look at some of these pictures, because people are suggesting that this is evidence that DEW weapons were used because they were, they're directed weapons. Okay, so what I'm trying, my thesis here is that energy can be directed in a number of ways, and so we combine the chemtrails. Okay, so there's a form of directing energy. Okay, because if we're creating a grid in the sky, if we're creating a grid pattern, then it's actually somewhat like the grid that we're finding with the electrical grid, only it's in the sky and it's just been made virtual. It becomes like a soup that we're walking around in with electromagnetic energy. I was talking last night about how the smart meters that are on each of our homes, if we didn't stand in the way and insist that they not be put there. By the way, that all rolled out by December 31st, 2012, worldwide, unless there were countries that opted out. And I only think there was one. I think it was Holland that opted out. So basically, the entire world was weaponized, in my opinion. And we talked about it then. You can take a look at some of the videos that I have on my playlist. I was doing radio shows then, as I said, with Dr. Ole Johansson and Sandra Perlingeri. So sorry, sometimes I get tongue-tied. And I need to write things down. I'm going by memory here. Everybody's name. Dr. Jerry Flynn. I talked to... what in the world are they spraying? Why in the world are they spraying? Michael Murphy, and he was talking to me from Hawaii, and that was in 2011, I do believe. And they were noticing the difference in on some of the farms in Hawaii that were away from any of the possible contaminants except things that came from the sky. So wouldn't you know that they're going to use the sky as part of the weapon system? And so again, when we look at, I'm just going to, again, we'll just go over and take a look at these patterns. So if you can see, there's sort of a grid idea with a lot of these. They crisscross or they go over a certain area. And then you take a look at these, what used to be homes, and you imagine that they are filled with electrical wiring. A lot of them have so-called smart technology, which if you take a look at Agenda 21, I did an interview with Rosa Quarry. We talked about smart technology. Anything that is smart is necessarily going to be communicating with the smart meter. So it's smart cars, smart this, smart that. And so imagine these homes that are not only have smart technology in them, but they also, and a smart meter on the side, but they also have wiring in all of the walls and, every 15 feet or so. And that might be even farther than a lot of people these days. They have electrical outlets, and so the houses themselves have a lot going on in them that those trees do not have going on. And those trees actually have a root system that goes down deep. So the bushes and things that are a bit smaller, they can be very much affected by fire. But the bigger trees are not wired. So that's the best way that I can put it. I'm trying to make it as simple as possible for people. They're not wired. And so I'm going to show you the difference between that, for instance, and another community where it was maybe a newer landscaping. That could be the reason. Again, we need to look at these images forensically. I'm just trying to show you how to look at images because you can see the difference between something like that community where you have some mature trees growing along in the background. So it looks as though this community was kind of cut out of a forest or a fairly dense area of trees. They put the houses in, and I've actually done landscaping, and I know you just mow it down. We've all seen this. They go in, they take a D9 or whatever, and they just mow everything down, and then they put in the houses. And so this community, they could have mowed every single thing down, and so the trees were not mature and they weren't full of water. So, again, looking at different images, you see different things. For those of you that were tuned in last night, you'll also remember that we were looking at toasted cars, and you may not know what I'm talking about if you weren't tuned in last night. But if you take a look at this image, you see that there's a bunch of cars parked here, and some of them are affected and some of them are not affected. And so, again, that gives you an indication that the fire it touches some things and not other things, whereas electromagnetic frequencies directed energy, I'm talking about directed energy weapons, as we were talking about last night, actually they will actually affect cars in ways that fire doesn't. And so if you want to take a look at that, let me just take a look and see if I can find one of the images that we had last night. And so let's take a look. That's one of the ones that we were talking about last night. These are not fires. They're called Cheeto fires. It's a reaction that takes place, and this is just as the buildings at the World Trade Center were falling. It's a reaction that took place at the same time that the buildings were dustifying. Sorry, they weren't falling. They're turning to dust. So let's just take another look just to remind ourselves from last night. So fire affects vehicles in a different way than directed energy does. If you take a look at this image of the police car, again, what's happened is that it affects the electronics, and so you can see that the trunk has opened, and this happened with a lot of the vehicles, and this was about a mile away. This was not as a result of fire. It's as a result of some sort of a phenomenon that was taking place, some sort of a reaction that was taking place. And you can see that you can see the waxed spot as Dr. Wood points out there. There's, some of the areas are absolutely pristine, but the thing that I want you to notice again is that the tires are, one's intact in the back, but the one in the front is disappeared. It's gone. It's absolutely gone. There's just a rim left. It hasn't melted. It's just gone. And so that's something that I want to point out as well. So when we're taking a look at these other cars that were in the driveway, then we can notice that some of them were totally unaffected at all. They didn't have this kind of patterning on them. They weren't affected at all, or they were like the plastic was burned, the tires were melted, everything was melted together and fused together. So what I wanted to show you, okay, so we've done the rocket stove. I'm just going to show you a couple of other images here. Let's just take a look. Where is my producer? I'm just trying to bring things up for you. Let me just grab another image here for you. And okay, so what I just wanted to focus on the cars just for one more second, because I do have another picture of, okay, those are the toasted cars, but I would like to get a car from, oh, okay, here we go. Let me show you this. This is a picture of a vehicle in California. So you can take a look and see the difference there, because we just looked at that police car there. And then now we can look at this vehicle, and you can see that there's melting that's going on here. That's what fires do. And you can see how the different, so people will say, oh, well, it's proof that it was a DEW weapon because all of the glass is gone. Well, yeah, in a high heat, the glass will disappear. But the strange thing about this car is that there was not high heat. It was a reaction, and it reacted with certain materials. And it wasn't as a result of traditional fires. And so that would rule out a directed energy weapon that is the same one that they would be using on 9/11, because this pattern is one of fire, and it's quite different. So again, just taking a look at the differences and seeing how... and you can see that there is a fire over here. Do you know, it's interesting if you take a look at images from 9/11, the things that Dr. Wood calls Cheeto fires begin to really stand out because they're not the traditional fires. They're not the fires like in this image here. They have a completely different look to them, much like what John Hutchison was observing when he was doing his experimentation. Okay, so I just want to compare this shot here. This is actually a picture that was taken in Australia. This is actually a coal mine fire, and you can see the way that the fire is actually it's sort of clinging to the side of the hill, and it's actually finding something to destroy in its path. It's so hot that it's just consuming everything along the way, and it actually looks like lava. Mind you, it is a coal fire, and it has a lot of fuel, but it just goes to show you how it sort of creates its own weather system at a certain point. Oops, let me just go back to that for a minute. And so fire actually, just like with the rocket stove, it does create its own weather, and it gets up to incredible temperatures. And when it does that, it actually starts to do some weird stuff. It actually creates sort of a tornado effect. And this is an image that was actually taken in Australia. I don't know exactly the date, but it's a typical firenado. I think that's the name that they've given it. But as you can see, it actually creates sort of a tornado effect. And it's interesting, too, because a lot of people don't realize that there was a hurricane off of the coast at 9/11. And so, again, a lot of these phenomena in nature help to trigger things. They trigger other effects, and they create. They can actually, jump the fire line. They can do all sorts of weird things. But when you see something like that, you realize the intensity and the power of these fires, and on their own, without any help from the EMFs or smart meters or anything else, they can. They just have an enormous power, and they have very strange characteristics. Some things that if you haven't been there, you might not actually have seen. Now, the other thing that's interesting is there was a report today on like mainstream media on CBS or something, where they were talking about the fact that the fires were started under the power lines. They were noticing, and of course now there's some lawsuits with PG&E, and they're saying that it's their fault. And the other thing too that I find really interesting is that there was a woman that was interviewed, and she said that they didn't turn off the power. They have these standards where they will turn off the power when there's a catastrophe, and yet they didn't do that. So imagine those homes that are powered, that have the smart technology, and imagine something like this comes along, because the fire has become so intense. And one thing that you notice about this is this tornado effect actually is going along and consuming anything in its path that is available to it. It's basically it's sort of like a lightning rod, only it's a fire rod, and it's going to anything that is combustible. So if you imagine those homes, you take a look at those houses that we were looking at that have the smart technology in them, and you take a look at something like this, this tornado here, and then you begin to realize that it's actually not as weird as you thought, that it would that fires would actually be attracted to the houses and not necessarily to the trees. You can see that here. So, and again, I'm not in any way suggesting that a weapon wasn't used, but I do believe that it's a much more passive sort of situation, because, people are sort of saying, they're saying they saw this blue beam in the sky, and they may very well have. I don't in any way disqualify the idea that that there were blue beams or whatever, but sometimes we see things and we put them together as though they're part of the phenomenon, and that's not necessarily the case. And so just something to think about when you look at some of these images and you see how phenomenal the weather patterns are that the fire actually creates in and of itself. So I'm just going to go back here to Dr. Judy Wood's website. Again, the towers didn't burn up and they didn't slam to the ground. They turned mostly to dust in midair. They didn't turn to smoke. They didn't burn up. And a lot of people were talking about how hot the fires were at Ground Zero. You know, Giuliani was standing out there and talking about it and saying, oh, these fires are 2,500 degrees. Well, if they were 2,500 degrees, then the hydraulic lines on that were being used, the air lines and the weld lines and various other, I mean, even the rubber itself would have actually have gone. You would have disappeared. And, you wouldn't find any capable, educated human being out there using hydraulic equipment or using acetylene or anything else if there is 2,500 degree fires going on. So that doesn't seem to make very much sense. So I really suggest that you go over to drjudywood.com. Again, her website's changed. It used to be that you could just take a look at some of these images and really just study them. You still can go in. There's this moving show. There's this, it kind of just keeps going on the front page. But don't be discouraged. Go in and take a look at some of the other links, because you can take a look at the images more closely and compare them with some of the images that we're seeing from the California fires. So I'm not going to actually go into some the other reports. I'm actually going to save those for tomorrow night. There's some other videos that I want to share with you, but one of them has to do with these EMFs that have been, I guess they're calling them weapons. And I think that's really important. It's a huge breakthrough to know that they're actually calling these attacks that happened in Cuba last year between June of 2017 and so let's see. I'm just going to take a look for the Cuban embassy story and see if I can just find the actual story itself so that you can take a look at it. Because I think it's a huge breakthrough. And if any of us feel like we're not able to make a difference, then definitely we can take a look at these kinds of stories and realize that that's absolutely not true. We very much can make a huge difference, if we're willing to actually educate ourselves, understand what's going on in the world, and take a look at some of these stories that are coming out, and I think they're going to come out more and more. So Canada's brain-injured Cuba diplomats speak out about Ottawa's silence. And so there is a video, but I think this is actually just as helpful if we take a look at this story. And so this is actually in the Globe and Mail, which is a Canadian newspaper. And it's definitely something that people are, would say that is mainstream, definitely mainstream. So I like sometimes to get things that are very mainstream so that people can't accuse us of just picking and choosing our stories. And it actually comes through the Associated Press. And, not that I trust the Associated Press in any way, but I think it's good for people that are still convinced that the mainstream media is the only way to get your news. So I just wanted to sort of end on this because I think it's really important that we see that these guys have been working on this. Again, my friend Allison, who's in Ecuador, and I were working on this on another YouTube channel where we were doing videos on how we were investigating this story. I'm sorry, that did not come out at all right. Anyway, we were trying to investigate this story because nobody had heard about it. In fact, some U.S. diplomats were affected as well. And so far, I haven't heard anything about that. But what happened was in the spring of 2017, a dozen embassy staff and their family members, including 8 adults and 4 children, almost simultaneously began experiencing symptoms including gushing nosebleeds, ringing in the ears, fits of nausea, dizziness, incapacitating headaches, and mental impairment, often striking most intensely in their homes late at night. Those affected represent about a third of the embassy staff. So, you see, if there's enough people, even though it's not that many, if there's enough of them that actually report back that they're having these symptoms, instead of, oh, maybe it's just me, that there's just, I better not tell anybody else because they'll think I'm nuts. Even if it takes a year and a half and, brain injuries, it finally will come out. The truth will come out. So it says, after a months-long struggle with the embassy to recognize their symptoms, like that's the worst part. Not only are you having these symptoms, clearly nosebleeds, ringing, nausea, like ringing in the ears, you can't really verify too well, but the nausea and the nosebleeds, and of course that's psychosomatic. But the fact that there were so many of them that have these issues, and this again happened in the U.S. Embassy as well. And they were finally diagnosed by neurologists as having suffered brain injuries similar to a concussion. So what I wanted, how this relates to the fires, how this relates to the smart meters, and how it relates to the EMFs and the chemtrails, is that this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of weaponry that is being used now, and I believe will continue to be used into the future. And it's very insidious because it's not, it's not now coming from the wires that we can see on the ground, or the laser beams necessarily. But sometimes you combine a certain weather pattern with the geoengineering that's going on with the smart meters and some electromagnetic, which creates electromagnetic frequencies. Even the fact that those homes had wireless internet, for instance, that all becomes a weapon at a certain point. And here is the evidence of what can happen in that case. And so after months-long struggle, they actually, they call this now the Havana Syndrome. It's disabled 24 staff in the recently reopened U.S. Embassy in the Cuban capital at around the same time. And so, they've been evacuating various people. So now this is really, this is the part that I think is really important. So these diplomats finally decided to speak to the Globe and Mail about their frustrations in seeking treatment and recognition. While Washington has been outspoken in speculating that those brain injuries were caused by mysterious energy weapon attacks by some foreign power, the Canadian diplomats have remained an obscure and largely unknown footnote. The U.S. victims have been subject to very public investigation, while Ottawa has kept its case and Canada's multi-agency investigation into it largely quiet for what diplomats believe are strategic and organizational reasons. Okay, so while they say that the U.S. has actually been looking into it, it's been very, very hush-hush, and it's hard to find information. Most people do not know about this. And actually, this is happening at the Chinese embassy as well. There's these certain sounds, and some of them are beyond the spectrum, the resonance, that you can actually hear, sort of like a dog whistle. So it's really high pitched, or you can't hear it at all, or it's only certain people can hear it because it's at a certain frequency. So it's really hard to verify. Anyway, I really think that with the it's sort of like the fraud with the voter fraud that's taking place. It takes a few people to actually come forward and take the risk. And in this case, I guess they had nothing to lose because in some cases they were deathly ill. And, as I said, we all love our jobs. We want to represent our country. So these are people that have no vested interest in creating problems or making stuff up. They are just people who have suffered because of these weapons. But I do find it really interesting that they're calling them weapons. And I think it won't be too long before we recognize that there's weapons being used, whether it's passive or whether it's directed. The fact that a fire starts, the fact that you geoengineer an area like California, and you create a drought situation and all the conditions where a fire will thrive, along with the fact that you're not cleaning the underbrush, along with the fact that you have these smart technologies, along with the fact that you have a grid system. And if you take a look at the technology that goes into a rocket stove, you can see that it's really not that hard to feed a fire. If you can do it in a little model like that, you can certainly do it on a larger scale. So I'm going to leave it at that. And if you found anything useful, I hope that you'll, comment, and I hope that you'll like and share this, whatever you found interesting in the video. And I'm going to be talking about some of the other aspects of the fires tomorrow night, to do with the weather, but also to do with the technology itself. And if you do have any questions for Dr. Judy Wood, I will pass them along to her. You can add them to the comment section. And as I say, do educate yourself with some of this stuff. Go over to her site, buy the book, go and take a look at how fires work. Take a look at that video that I have up on the Australian fires from 2009, because it's almost 10 years ago. So, people will say that it's climate change. Okay. But even if it is, then what are you going to do about it? But the point is that this was happening 10 years ago. And just because it wasn't in people's backyard, they didn't seem to care so much. But there are people that have been suffering a lot of loss, not the houses are the least of it, because so many people, like at this point, almost 1,000 people are missing still. And I just, my heart goes out to all of those who are dealing with this. And I just don't want it to go on anymore. It could happen to any one of us if it's allowed to go on. If it's not brought out into the light, then anything can happen. And I don't want to see any more people suffering needlessly. I understand that there are all sorts of things that take place that we really, we can't control things, but we can certainly speak up when we see things that are avoidable, or things that are being done in a mercenary sort of way. And I do think that there's definitely some pretty crazy stuff that's happening out there that that we can bring to the attention of the authorities in the same way that these guys, that the diplomats have been doing. And we need to put a stop to it. We need to let them know that we're on to the situation, we're on to the technology, and we're not going to accept it. And if you have smart appliances or anything else in your home, just be aware that it's not just that there's an ability to spy on us through those. They can spy on us in any number of ways, but there's actual weaponry that can be unleashed through that technology. And it's not to be alarmist about it, but I just feel like if there's any chance that these fires were deliberately set in any way, then we're all vulnerable. And I guess if that's the only way that we can become activists, knowing that it can affect us, our children, our grandchildren, then that's what I'm here to do. So let's all be character driven. And until tomorrow night, I'm going to leave you and wish you well and tell you all how much I appreciate you. And I just want you to care for one another. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. Love you.